Dear viewers, welcome back. Today, we are going to talk about economic chaos and the political paralysis that is fast unraveling Europe's ambitions to be a global powerhouse. From Paris to Berlin, Madrid to Brussels, we are seeing a chain reaction of crises that are threatening not just individual nations but the entire framework of the European Union (EU). Europe is facing unprecedented challenges: economic stagnation, industrial decline, political instability, and failure to adapt to seismic shifts in global dynamics. Now, where does this all leave the dream of European integration? Let's dive into this by understanding some of the latest developments. Before we get into it fully, let me make one thing clear. Europe isn't the only major force facing these challenges. Both China and the United States have their own monumental problems, but Europe's inability to respond swiftly and collectively to crises is setting it up for potential disaster on a scale we haven't seen for decades. Now let's break this down. First, in France, the political climate couldn't get more complicated. Macron, who once touted himself as the savior of European unity, has now succumbed to far-right pressure. The far-right forces in France now have veto power over essential economic reforms. What does this mean for the EU? It means instability right at the heart of the European integration project. France isn't just a random EU member, it's a core player, a founding member of the Union. With France bowing to the nationalist tide, long-term investment strategies, necessary labor reform, and industrial revitalization will either be delayed or never happen. Already, France's position on certain European policies, including trade deals and defense strategies, has deviated from EU norms. And then there's Germany. This is perhaps one of the most shocking turns of events. Germany, the engine of Europe's industrial might, is seeing its manufacturing base reel from global disruptions. German carmakers, once the pride of Europe, are considering closing domestic factories for the first time ever. This signals not just a setback for Germany but also for Europe's economic strength at large. The very cornerstone of Europe's trade surplus is falling apart. For instance, Volkswagen declared possible shutdowns unless significant structural reforms were made to counter competition from China and the looming energy crises. Add to this, inflation in Germany hit levels not seen in decades, hovering above 6% in mid-2024. This high inflation is further reducing consumer spending, which depresses demand even more, creating a vicious circle. So, how can the EU government ignore this? The once all-powerful Germany has now become a liability for Europe's future growth. If Germany falters, we're not talking about a recession in just one country. It has an extensive supply chain that spans all of Europe and beyond. This could set off a continental recession. Let me hit you with a real data bombshell. According to Eurostat, if the EU had kept pace with US productivity growth over the past 2 decades, the European economy would be about 3 trillion euros larger. That's right, 3 trillion euros. The average worker's income would be higher by around 13,000 euros per year. This represents the stagnation that Europe's economic reformers have warned about for years, and it's devastating. One of the most glaring reminders of Europe's decline came recently from US tech giants, namely Apple and Meta, pulling out their investment in Europe's AI sector due to the bloc's restrictive regulations. Now, let me paint this picture. Europe, which prides itself on being the world's regulation capital, might force the biggest technological companies to take their business elsewhere. You see, the problem is not just regulation for the sake of safety or ethics, an important aspect, no doubt. It's the regulatory overreach, more concerned with political signaling than practical considerations, that is stifling innovation. The EU is simply not competitive in attracting cutting-edge tech companies anymore. Europe, the so-called global standard setter, finds itself setting standards for technologies it's not even a frontrunner in anymore. As both China and the US pour billions into artificial intelligence, tackling innovation with agility and scale, Europe appears trapped in bureaucratic gridlock. Latest figures show that while the US invested over $100 billion directly into AI and related tech sectors in 2023, Europe managed only a fraction of that amount. Europe absurdly tries to enforce restrictive AI laws that even its own firms cannot comply with in such a competitive global environment. So big names like Apple and Meta are withdrawing to where? The US and even Asia. This is a red alert. Europe's choice to be overly precautionary in technological innovations may ironically preclude it from benefiting at all. Europe's reliance on Russian energy ended abruptly with the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And my dear audience, This event shattered Europe's incredibly dependent energy model. Russian gas was cheap and plentiful. It powered the continent's heavy machinery, industries, and households. Without it, Europe's industrial base has had to scramble for alternative energy sources, which are not only more expensive but difficult to secure long-term. Can Europe hope to shield its industries from skyrocketing costs? Unlikely. The only path forward might be green energy, but Europe faces stiff competition from the US there too. US President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act earmarked hundreds of billions of dollars toward green energy subsidies, electric vehicles, and technological innovation. The likes of Tesla and energy firms are gearing up to dominate this space while Europe lags far behind. It's no wonder French President Macron has finally admitted, if we follow our classic agenda, we will be out of the market. That's code for, if we don't act fast, we will simply no longer be economically viable. This political fragmentation process is speeding up. Now, we've all heard of Viktor Orban, Hungary's head at odds with Brussels over policies ranging from immigration to LGBTQ rights. Whatever your stance on those issues, the bigger takeaway is that Hungary and other member states, in Eastern Europe particularly, are now looking at the EU not as a partner but as a foe. Brussels' centralized decision-making on critical issues, including foreign policy, industrial priorities, and defense collaboration, is deteriorating mutual trust. France, traditionally a proponent of deep European integration, has opted for a strategy of selective engagement with smaller groups of nations, sidelining traditional EU alliances. Spain, while still pro-European on the surface, has made overtures to China to strengthen trade ties outside EU frameworks. Poland, facing external threats from Russia, has been in discussions for defense ties with the United States, bypassing EU defense mechanisms in favor of working directly with NATO. What we are witnessing is nothing short of the gradual erosion of Europe's unity. This isn't about disillusioned Eurosceptics on the periphery. It's about core members looking for alternatives outside the bloc. And who can blame them? If Europe as a whole is paralyzed economically, politically, and technologically, these nations are realizing that national self-interest reigns supreme in a time of crisis. In conclusion, Europe's future as a geopolitical force hinges on its ability to adapt swiftly to changing global landscapes. That includes reinventing industry, pushing for innovation-friendly regulation, and eliminating internal divisions. But if these current trends persist, Europe faces a widening gap against countries like the US and China. For Europe, sluggish productivity growth remains its Achilles heel. If nothing changes, the continent will become akin to developing countries that once missed the Industrial Revolution and struggled to modernize for decades afterward. The time for half measures is gone. Europe is at its tipping point. Its leaders must choose whether it will enter a new age of prosperity through reform, or face the long, painful slide toward economic irrelevance. Now, what do you think? Has Europe lost its way for good? Or are there strategies to revitalize this once great economic bloc? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep economic insights. Stay tuned, because things are heating up in Europe, and we'll be keeping a close watch. Until next time, folks.